The whole courtroom started laughing before the hearing even began. One guy sitting near the back actually leaned over to his friend and said, "No way, that's the defendant." A woman covered her nose dramatically as a tall man walked down the center aisle wearing faded blue coveralls stained with grease, transmission fluid, and years of hard work. The funny thing was, the man didn't seem embarrassed at all. He didn't lower his head. He didn't try to explain himself. He just carried a small cardboard box under one arm and quietly took his seat. Looking back now, I think that's what bothered people the most. He wasn't ashamed. And when somebody isn't ashamed of being exactly who they are, it makes insecure people uncomfortable. His name wasn't Miguel Alvarez. In this version of the story, let's call him Daniel Mercer. Daniel had owned Mercer Automotive for nearly 27 years in a small Pennsylvania town where people still waved from pickup trucks and knew each other's first names. His shop sat behind an old diner called Betty's Grill, the kind of place where the coffee was always fresh and the gossip traveled faster than the internet. Daniel wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. Most people outside town had never heard of him. But if your car broke down at midnight, if your daughter got stranded on a highway during a snowstorm, if your elderly father needed transportation to a doctor's appointment and couldn't afford repairs, Daniel was usually the guy who showed up. The strange thing about respect is that it rarely looks impressive from the outside. Daniel's shop wasn't pretty. The roof leaked during heavy rain. The waiting room had mismatched chairs collected over 20 years. Half the coffee machine buttons didn't work. But every vehicle that left that garage left fixed properly. That's why people kept coming back. Not because of marketing. Not because of appearance. Because trust is hard to earn and easy to lose. Daniel understood that better than most. Years earlier, after his wife passed away from cancer, he practically lived in that garage. Some nights he'd stay until 2 in the morning rebuilding engines because going home to an empty house hurt too much. The work became therapy. The customers became family. And little by little, without realizing it, Daniel built something stronger than a business. He built a reputation. Then everything changed when Sterling Performance Motors arrived in town. If Mercer Automotive felt like an old baseball glove, Sterling felt like a luxury hotel. Massive glass walls, marble floors, complimentary espresso, giant television screens everywhere. Their showroom looked more like an airport lounge than a car dealership. The owner, Victor Langford, loved attention almost as much as he loved money. He wasn't a mechanic. He was a salesman. The kind of guy who could convince someone they needed a new vehicle when all they really needed was fresh brake pads. When Sterling opened, everybody assumed Daniel would be finished within a year. Honestly, even Daniel wondered if they might be right. How do you compete with a company that spends more on advertising in a month than you make in a year? But something unexpected happened. Customers kept returning to Mercer Automotive. Some tried Sterling once and never went back. Others walked through the shiny showroom, looked at the repair estimates, nearly choked, then drove straight to Daniel's garage. Victor noticed. And the more he noticed, the angrier he became. One afternoon, according to a former employee who later testified, Victor stood inside his office staring out the window and asked a simple question. Why are people still going there? Nobody answered. Because nobody wanted to say the truth out loud. They trusted Daniel more than they trusted him. That's when things started getting ugly. First came the online reviews. Hundreds of them. 1-star ratings from people nobody in town had ever heard of. Comments claiming Daniel damaged engines. Claims he overcharged customers. Claims he used counterfeit parts. Daniel wasn't particularly good with computers, so he didn't even realize what was happening at first. Then came surprise inspections. Health inspectors. Safety inspectors. Environmental inspectors. Week after week, someone seemed to be finding a reason to stop by. Most found nothing. A few issued tiny citations for issues that would have normally received a warning. Daniel fixed everything and kept working. But the pressure was building. Betty, the diner owner next door, noticed it before anyone else. One morning, she handed Daniel a coffee and said, "You look tired." Daniel laughed. "That's because I am." "No," she replied quietly. "You look worried." For a second, he didn't answer. Then he stared out the diner window toward his garage and said something that stuck with her for years. "I've spent my whole life fixing things, Betty. But I don't know how to fix people who want to break things." Neither of them knew it yet, but the worst was still coming. Because while Daniel was trying to survive, somebody on the other side was planning something much bigger than fake reviews and inspections. They wanted him gone completely. And a few weeks later, A bright red custom sports car would roll into Mercer Automotive carrying the beginning of a trap so carefully designed that most people would have never seen it coming. The car showed up on a Tuesday morning just after sunrise, the kind of morning where the air still carried a little chill and the town hadn't fully woken up yet. Daniel was underneath an old pickup replacing a fuel line when he heard the sound first. A low growl, expensive and deliberate. He rolled out from under the truck and saw a bright red custom-built sports car easing into the lot. It looked completely out of place sitting between rusty work trucks and family sedans. The driver was a young guy, maybe 23 or 24, wearing designer sunglasses and a watch that probably cost more than Daniel's toolbox. He introduced himself as Tyler Brooks, said he'd recently moved into the area and heard good things about Mercer Automotive. Looking back, Daniel would later admit there was something about the kid that felt rehearsed, but after 27 years in business, he'd learned not to judge people too quickly. The repair request seemed simple enough. Basic tune-up, oil service, engine inspection before a long road trip. Nothing unusual. Daniel completed the work himself, documented every step, photographed the parts, recorded the service order, and handed the keys back 2 days later. Tyler smiled, paid the invoice, thanked him, and drove away. End of story. Or at least that's what Daniel thought. About 2 weeks later, he was eating lunch at Betty's Grill when a process server walked through the front door. The entire diner went silent. Everyone watched as the man approached Daniel's booth and placed a thick envelope on the table. Daniel still remembered the feeling in his stomach before he even opened it. Sometimes you don't know what's wrong yet, but your gut already does. Inside was a lawsuit. Sterling Performance Motors claimed Daniel had installed unauthorized parts, damaged critical engine components, and caused over $140,000 in losses. Daniel read the paperwork 3 times because the number didn't seem real. Then he looked across the diner at Betty. This has to be some kind of mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was exactly what they intended. The lawsuit spread through town fast. Faster than any advertisement ever could. Local social media pages exploded with rumors. People started asking questions. Some customers canceled appointments. Others called just to see if the stories were true. A few longtime customers stood by him. But Daniel could feel something changing. Trust takes years to build and only moments to shake. One evening he sat alone inside his garage long after closing, staring at the lawsuit spread across his workbench. For the first time in years he felt tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. It wasn't fear of losing money. It wasn't even fear of losing the business. It was the feeling that somebody had decided the truth didn't matter anymore. That was harder to accept. A week later, Daniel attended a preliminary hearing. Victor Langford was there. So was his legal team. Daniel noticed something strange as he walked past them in the hallway. Tyler, the young driver, was laughing with Victor like old friends. Not customers. Not business associates. Friends. The second Daniel saw that, something clicked. That kid wasn't random, he thought. He was part of this. Suddenly, the entire situation looked different. Daniel went home that night and pulled every service record related to the vehicle. Then he returned to the garage and started reviewing security footage. Hour after hour passed. Midnight came and went. Then 2 in the morning. Then 3. Most people would have given up. Daniel didn't. Mechanics develop patience because machines rarely reveal problems immediately. You keep looking until something doesn't fit. Around 4 o'clock in the morning he found it. The footage wasn't dramatic. In fact, if you blinked you'd miss it. Tyler arrived about 15 minutes before the scheduled appointment. He parked behind the building where cameras barely reached. But one camera captured a partial angle. Daniel watched the footage again. Then one more time. Tyler opened the hood, reached into the engine compartment, worked on something for several minutes, then closed everything and drove around front as if nothing happened. Daniel leaned back in his chair. His heartbeat started climbing. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe it meant everything. The next few weeks turned into a private investigation. Daniel started talking to people. Not aggressively. Not like a detective. Just conversations. A gas station attendant remembered seeing Tyler bragging to friends. A parts supplier recalled hearing Sterling employees joke about putting Mercer Automotive out of business. Then Betty remembered something even more interesting. One Friday night, several weeks before the lawsuit, Tyler and a group of friends had eaten dinner at the diner. They were loud, cocky, the kind of young men who assumed nobody around them mattered. At one point, Tyler laughed and said, My dad says by Christmas that old grease monkey won't even have a garage anymore. Betty hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now it sounded different. Daniel asked if anyone else heard it. 3 customers remembered the comment clearly. They agreed to provide written statements. Suddenly pieces were starting to connect. Then came the breakthrough nobody expected. One of Daniel's longtime customers was a retired electrician named Frank Dawson. Frank spent years doing contract work around town and knew practically everyone. After hearing about the lawsuit, he stopped by the garage one afternoon. "You ever hear about the party at Langford's Lake House?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. Frank scratched his chin. "My nephew was there. Said some interesting things were said after a few drinks." That conversation led Daniel to another witness. Then another. Eventually, one young man agreed to share an audio recording from the party. He hadn't intended to gather evidence. He was simply recording friends acting stupid. But buried inside the recording was something remarkable. The voice was unmistakably Tyler's. Laughing, bragging, showing off. At one point he said, "It's already done. Dad says the lawsuit will bury him. That garage will be gone before spring." The room around him erupted with laughter. Then another voice asked, "What if he proves it?" Tyler answered without hesitation, "Prove what? Nobody listens to a mechanic over a dealership." Daniel sat in silence after hearing the recording. Not because he was shocked. Deep down he'd already suspected the truth. What stunned him was how careless they had become. How certain they were that nobody would ever challenge them. For the first time since receiving the lawsuit, he felt something different than fear. Hope. The evidence kept growing. Security footage, witness statements, audio recordings, service records, inspection reports. Every piece pointed toward the same conclusion. The damage didn't happen inside Mercer Automotive. It happened before the vehicle ever arrived. Meanwhile, Sterling's legal team became more aggressive. They assumed Daniel was overwhelmed. During one meeting, their lead attorney actually laughed and said, "You should consider settling before this gets worse." Daniel simply nodded. "Maybe." The attorney smiled confidently. Smart decision. What he didn't realize was that Daniel had already stopped thinking about defense. He was preparing an offense. Weeks later, as the trial date approached, Betty asked him if he was nervous. Daniel looked across the garage at the same workbench where he'd spent decades fixing other people's problems. "Terrified," he admitted. "Then why do you seem calm?" she asked. Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he smiled. "Because lies are expensive to maintain. The truth only has one job." On the morning of the trial, he packed every piece of evidence into a small cardboard box, put on his usual grease-stained work coveralls because he hadn't come to impress anyone, and drove toward the courthouse. He had no idea that by the end of the day the people laughing at him would be desperately looking for a way out. By the time Daniel walked into the courtroom that morning, Sterling's side already looked like they were attending a victory celebration. Victor Langford sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than Daniel earned in a month. His attorneys were relaxed, joking quietly with one another, shuffling expensive leather folders across the table. Then Daniel entered carrying his little cardboard box, and the room reacted exactly the way you'd expect. A few people chuckled. Somebody whispered something about the smell of motor oil. One woman actually rolled her eyes. Daniel noticed all of it and ignored all of it. After 27 years of working around broken machines and stubborn people, he'd learned something important. Noise isn't the same thing as truth. When the hearing began, Sterling's attorneys presented their case first. They spoke confidently, using complicated legal language and dramatic phrases. They painted Daniel as careless, outdated, and unprofessional. At one point, the lead attorney glanced toward him and said, "This case demonstrates the danger of trusting critical repairs to individuals lacking modern standards." The insult wasn't subtle. A few people in the gallery nodded. Victor looked pleased with himself. Then the judge turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Mercer, would you like to respond?" Daniel stood slowly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Your Honor, I don't have a law degree. I don't have a marketing department. I don't know all the fancy words these gentlemen use. What I do know is engines. And I know when somebody is trying to sell a lie." The room grew quiet. Daniel opened the cardboard box. "Everything I'm about to show the court comes from cameras, witnesses, and records. Not opinions. Not advertisements. Facts." The first video appeared on the courtroom screen. At first it seemed ordinary. Then the footage zoomed in. Tyler exiting the sports car. Tyler opening the hood. Tyler reaching deep into the engine compartment before ever entering Mercer Automotive. The attorney's smile disappeared almost immediately. The second piece of evidence followed. Signed witness statements from local business owners and residents who heard Tyler bragging about putting Daniel out of business. Then came the audio recording. The courtroom speakers crackled softly before Tyler's voice filled the room. It's already done. Dad says the lawsuit will bury him. That garage will be gone before spring. The laughter from the party echoed through the speakers. Nobody in the courtroom laughed this time. You could practically feel the temperature change. Victor's face drained of color. His attorney suddenly looked like a man trying to remember where he left the emergency exit. The judge listened carefully, reviewed the evidence, asked several questions, then leaned back in her chair. The silence felt endless. Finally, she spoke. This court finds overwhelming evidence that the alleged damage was intentionally created before the vehicle entered Mercer Automotive. She paused. Furthermore, the evidence supports claims of defamation, fraudulent misrepresentation, and malicious prosecution. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then she delivered the part that people in town would be talking about for years. Sterling Performance Motors was ordered to pay damages, legal costs, and issue a public apology. Additional referrals were made for further investigation regarding business practices connected to the case. Victor looked stunned. The attorney stared at the table. And Daniel? Daniel simply stood there quietly, almost like he couldn't quite believe the fight was finally over. As people began filing out of the courtroom, something unexpected happened. A man wearing a military uniform approached him. He looked to be in his early 30s. Daniel recognized the face vaguely but couldn't place it. The soldier smiled. You probably don't remember me. Daniel laughed softly. I've fixed a lot of vehicles. The man nodded. 8 years ago, my Jeep died 3 days before deployment. I didn't have enough money for repairs. Daniel's expression changed. A memory surfaced. A nervous young soldier. A broken transmission. I remember. The soldier smiled wider. You fixed it for free. Daniel shrugged. You were serving the country. Felt like the right thing to do. The soldier looked down for a moment before speaking again. You told me not to pay you back. You said, just come home safe. For the first time all day, Daniel's eyes grew wet. The soldier extended his hand. Maybe because of you. I did. Neither man said anything for several seconds. They didn't need to. Some victories aren't measured in court judgments or financial settlements. Sometimes they're measured in lives quietly touched years earlier. A few months later, Mercer Automotive was busier than ever. People traveled from neighboring counties just to meet the mechanic who stood alone against a corporation and won. Sterling Performance Motors never fully recovered its reputation. But here's the part that still sparks arguments whenever this story gets told. Some people say Victor deserved everything that happened. Others argue Daniel should have sued for even more and completely destroyed the business. And a few believe public humiliation was punishment enough. Me? I'm not sure. What I do know is this. People laughed at a man because his clothes were stained with grease. They assumed appearance told the whole story. They assumed success looked like marble floors and expensive suits. In the end, the person with dirty hands turned out to be the only one with a clean conscience. So now I'd love to hear your opinion. Was the court's decision fair? Should Daniel have gone further after everything they put him through? Or was justice served the moment the truth came out? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever seen someone judged by appearance only to prove everyone wrong, share that story too. Sometimes the people the world overlooks end up teaching the biggest lessons.